Breath of the Wild is a prime example of an experimental video game done right. It successfully turned a beloved action-adventure franchise into a mesmerizing open world that gained critical acclaim due to its huge emphasis on player choice and freedom, unlike anything ever seen before. And fortunately, the announcement of a sequel shows us that the developers have a lot more to bring to the table regarding the Breath of the Wild storyline, and I can't express my excitement enough to find out exactly how the game's gonna play out. However, despite the original game being fantastic in its own light, there are a lot of things that I would like to see changed and improved upon to make the sequel the best that it can be. And in order to explain this best, we are being joined today by Hyrule Gamer to share with you all our ideas on how we would improve upon the original.
The first thing that we have to understand when going over what must be improved is that not every idea established in Breath of the Wild will translate into its sequel. Zelda games tend to be all vastly different from each other on a thematic level, so it would make sense if certain game-specific things like the shrines would not return in the sequel. However, there still are many things established in the past games that are likely to return in the sequel, such as dungeons. And no, I am not talking about more divine beasts, but more so something that follows the traditional line of what Zelda dungeons used to be. I am not saying that the divine beasts were bad by any means, as they actually did bring a lot to the table, with their emphasis on unique dungeon altering mechanisms, and their menacing exterior design that made the build up to these dungeons all the more interesting. However, the biggest problem with these dungeons is that they definitely stripped away a lot of what made Zelda dungeons fun to begin with, such as the unique atmospheres, boss battles, and progressive variation that the Divine Beasts all lack. I feel that the developers should go back to making dungeons more like how they did in the previous 3D games, but also integrate many of the unique Divine Beast elements within them to create an experience that's truly unique.
Adding on to this, I also really hope that the sequel's gameplay is centered a lot more around the dungeons than how Breath of the Wild was. In the classic 3D Zeldas, you spend roughly a quarter to a third of your total gameplay in the dungeons, but in Breath of the Wild, dungeons made up such a small percentage of the overall game to the point where they almost became a forgettable part of the overall experience. I'm not saying that the sequel should have as much of a dungeon emphasis as the classic Zelda games, as that wouldn't really blend as well with the open world nature, but I still think that it would be awesome if we got at least roughly 8 unique dungeons scattered across the map this time. This way, dungeons would be better paced throughout the experience without taking too much away from the open world. But this leads us into our next point of topic. If the next game is a lot more focused on the dungeons, while assumably stripping away the concept of shrines, what else besides towns, villages, and enemy camps fulfill in the space of this world?
This is where I am hoping that underground and underwater exploration come into play. These two things for the most part were absent in the original game, as just about everything took place on the surface of the world. However, the few times that the player actually got to explore underground in the game, such as when finding the Hebra Great Skeleton, were some of the coolest moments of exploring the world, and that's why I'm really hoping that this gets fleshed out more in the sequel. We already got a glimpse of a new underground area in the most recent trailer, and it already looks way cooler than anything we have seen in the original. I really hope that cave systems like this are scattered throughout the next game's world, as it would contrast very well to the dark theme that the developers seem to be pushing for this game. Also, these cave systems could act as a nice replacement to the shrines, as I would imagine them being filled with lots of enemies, progressive measures, and even some puzzles as well.
But moving on from the world and structural changes, let's talk about how the game might change on a mechanical level. I think that it's safe to assume that the sequel still had the same open-air feel as the original game, but I doubt that every single traversal and combat mechanic will carry over. Things like the climbing and paragliding have a good chance of returning, but in terms of the various combat mechanics like flurry rushing, parries, and bullet time, I think that they might be changing these things up for the sequel. The reason being is that players spent a lot of time perfecting these moves in the original game, and if all that skill can be easily translated over to the sequel, then not only will the combat feel super easy, but also, the original charm and joy of pulling off new combat possibilities for the first time will be lost. Instead, I feel that it would be best to balance these older moves by making them feel less practical in certain situations, and adding new moves that would help fill in the gaps. This way, returning players will still be able to use the great moves introduced in the original, while still learning new ones that prevent the experience from getting stale.
And this goes beyond just combat too, as I would like to see even more traversal mechanics introduced, specifically ones that take advantage of the water. Despite how much the original tried to encourage the player to travel by water, it never felt like a worthwhile thing to do. There were rafts by just about every body of water, and there was a Zora armor set that allowed faster swimming, but both of these methods were still slower and more tedious than just traveling by foot. The sequel could improve upon this by making both of these methods a lot more practical for the world. Rafts would be helpful if the world contained more large water masses, like the one leading to Eventide Island. And the Zora armor would be very useful if the speed actually matched the Zora swimming speed from Majora's Mask. But most importantly, I think the most important addition that the sequel needs to add to its water mechanics is the ability to swim underwater. This was one of the big aspects about Breath of the Wild that always felt missing to me, and if they actually implement it within the sequel along with some really cool underwater locations, I think it could really make the world even more interesting.
Lastly, there is one final thing that we would like to see change in the sequel, and that is the game's overall progression and structure. Although Breath of the Wild was praised for its convention-breaking open world and its non-linear structure, this style of gameplay naturally restricted the game from having a strong linear narrative and other progressive measures like the classic Zelda items. Now, Breath of the Wild did manage to be very successful without these elements, but I honestly don't mind if the next game takes a slightly more linear route if it means getting them back. I still think that there should be an expansive open world like its predecessor, but what if just a select few structures and locations were blocked off from the start, which will be important in both story and gameplay progression down the road. Sure, it does take a little bit away from the freedom part, but having a much stronger and progressive story will help justify an open-ended game like Breath of the Wild with getting a direct sequel in the first place.
This also ties in well with what we were saying about the dungeons earlier, as assuming we get around 8 or more of them in the sequel, these structures could be used as the main method of story progression. After all, even the Zelda games with the strongest stories only really have a few major plot points. One at the beginning, one at the end, and a couple in the middle that usually take place after a set of dungeons. And these games' stories all turned out great. However, because of the non-linear structure of Breath of the Wild, it could only have one plot point at the beginning and one at the end, with basically no room for story development. Assuming that Breath of the Wild's sequel sticks with the more classic route of story progression through the dungeons, this could be key to delivering a strong narrative like no other Zelda game before.
But anyways, what do you guys think about these changes? We covered a lot of the big ones in this video, but there definitely are a lot of smaller ones that I could discuss in a future video down the road. But in the meantime, a huge shout out to Hyrule Gamer for helping me out with this project. We have done a few other collaborations in the past, which I'll link in the description below, so feel free to check out his channel and subscribe there if you haven't done so already. Also, a huge shout out to my amazing patrons and YouTube members for supporting the channel. If you would like to help me out here for as little as $1 a month, all the information for that will be found down in the description below. Anyways, thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.